Something just dragged him under the water!
911, what is your emergency?
A man, he was running by the shoreline, and something huge grabbed him. I saw it pull him in.
Stay calm. Do you see him now? Can you describe what you saw?
No, he's gone. It was massive. It looked like an alligator.
The call itself is jagged, broken by panic and disbelief, but the truth within it is undeniable. On an ordinary morning, under the pale light of dawn, a runner named Jason Miller vanished in seconds, snatched from the safety of solid ground, and pulled into a watery abyss. It is the kind of nightmare most people only whisper about, the kind of story that makes headlines because it seems too brutal to be real. But here, on the edge of a Florida wetland, the unimaginable became reality. Jason's final run ended not with a finish line, but with a predator's strike, swift and merciless. This is not a legend or an exaggeration. These are true stories. Stay with us as we uncover the haunting details of Jason Miller's final moments. Subscribe to Animal Shock Stories and share your thoughts about this tragedy in the comments below. Jason Miller was the kind of man whose presence was felt more in his consistency than in any words he ever spoke. At 45, he was not the fastest runner in town, nor the one who joined flashy races or boasted about his times on social media, but everyone in his small Florida community knew him for his solitary dawn runs. The sight of him, lacing his worn shoes before the sun had fully broken the horizon, had become almost as natural as the mist that lifted off the wetlands at first light. He was disciplined, rising with quiet purpose day after day, his stride carrying him along the same looping path that traced the edge of the marsh. Neighbors admired him not because he sought attention, but because he embodied a kind of quiet resilience, someone who ran not to be seen, but to find peace within himself. People spoke of how he had once faced a difficult stretch in his life, a health scare that left him reevaluating what mattered, and how running had become his therapy, his way of reclaiming a rhythm when the rest of his world felt uncertain. There was something almost reverent about the way he leaned into those early hours, the sky still half dark, the dew clinging to the grass, the water beside him breathing its heavy silence. Yet that silence was never complete, for beneath its calm surface lay something far older, something waiting. Jason's path always hugged the shoreline, his shoes pounding just feet from the water's lip, and while he might have looked out over the glassy expanse without worry, others noticed. "Too close to the edge," a neighbor once murmured, watching him vanish into the fog. One day that water's going to answer back. He was admired, respected, even envied for his devotion, but stitched into the admiration was a thread of unease, a recognition that, in his pursuit of peace, he was moving along a line that separated the human world from the wild. And though Jason might not have seen it, or perhaps chose not to, every stride he took along that boundary was a silent invitation to forces that never forget the domain they rule. His runs were not reckless, at least not in his mind. They were rituals, steady and familiar, but rituals often blind us to their risks. The shoreline had become part of him, the water, his silent companion, and like many companions, it watched him more closely than he ever knew. In that fragile balance of discipline and denial, admiration and quiet dread, Jason Miller built the rhythm of his days, unaware that this devotion to routine, this closeness to the edge, would one morning become the thread upon which his fate was hung. The Florida wetlands at dawn were a place of deceptive beauty, the kind of landscape that lured the eye with softness and held the breath with its stillness. The first rays of light stretched low across the horizon, painting the sky in layers of gold and pale lavender, and the mist clung stubbornly to the surface of the water, a veil that blurred the line between earth and sky. It was the hour when night had not yet fully surrendered, when silence carried the weight of both peace and forewarning. Herons rose from the reeds in slow, deliberate arcs, their wings cutting through the mist like solemn brushstrokes, while smaller birds darted in bursts of energy, scattering across the mirror-like water. From a distance, it was a scene that could have been framed as art calm, pristine, untouched by the noise of human urgency. but beauty in the wetlands is never without its shadow. The stillness of the water concealed its own truths, movements beneath the surface, slow currents disrupted by something more deliberate, ripples too heavy to be the work of fish. The marsh grass whispered under a faint breeze, its hushed tones almost like warnings muffled by distance. To an unknowing passerby, the scene might seem holy in its quietness, a sanctuary untouched, but those who knew the land understood it as a paradox. For every heron rising, there was an eye submerged, unblinking and patient. For every ribbon of mist that curled upward in ethereal grace, there was the heavy body of a predator lying just beneath the sheen, camouflaged by the very calmness it exploited. Jason Miller's chosen path skimmed this border where human serenity brushed against ancient violence, and in those fragile moments of mourning, he ran through a stage that held both reverence and threat. The wetlands did not betray themselves openly. They did not shout their warnings or display their danger with spectacle. They waited, silent as stone, hiding the storm in the stillness, a contradiction both mesmerizing and merciless. This was the stage upon which Jason's story unfolded, a theater of calm beauty that cloaked its lurking menace, reminding us that the most haunting dangers are often wrapped in silence, waiting patiently beneath a surface that begs to be trusted. Jason's mornings began with ritual precision, a rhythm etched into his body as surely as the calluses on his feet. He would sit on the porch steps, the air still cool from the night, and pull the laces of his running shoes tight with the same quiet concentration he gave to everything in his life. The sound of the knot snapping firm was like a signal to his mind. It was time to move, to leave behind the clutter of yesterday. His strides soon followed, steady and measured, the soft slap of rubber against dirt, a cadence that carried him into solitude. For Jason, running was never about numbers or competition. It was a kind of unspoken prayer. Years earlier, when illness had bent his body and doubt had clouded his spirit, it was running that stitched him back together. Every step had been an act of defiance then, a refusal to be defined by weakness, and over time those steps became his sanctuary. Now, as his legs found their pace, his mind moved freely, turning over memories not with pain but with acceptance. The wetland path he chose was more than a track of earth, it was an extension of his own healing. He knew its bends, the way the roots lifted from the ground like veins, the way morning light caught on the still water and fractured into shimmering fragments. The land had become a companion, steady and unjudging, absorbing his struggles in silence. When he inhaled, he breathed not only the damp air, but the memory of battles already won, and when he exhaled, he released the weight of all he refused to carry anymore. To outsiders, it might have looked like routine, a man simply running the same path each morning, but to Jason it was communion, each stride a conversation with a landscape that had become sacred to him. He found peace not in escape from the wild, but in his closeness to it, trusting the calm, trusting the water, never seeing in its stillness the reflection of something waiting. His bond with the land was real, but bonds with nature are never equal, and his faith in its silence would prove to be his final blind devotion. The warnings had always been there, but like many truths wrapped in routine, they faded into the background until they were almost invisible. Locals spoke of a massive gator rumored to haunt the marsh edges, an old predator that had been seen surfacing in the early evenings, its head broad as a tire, its eyes gleaming above the weeds. Fishermen swapping stories at the bait shop described hearing sudden splashes in the pre-dawn hours, louder and heavier than any fish could make, and a few swore they had glimpsed the ridged back sliding through the water like a living shadow. Yet, as with many warnings, familiarity dulled their edge. Signs posted years earlier, bold red letters spelling, "Caution, alligators in area," had long since been sun-bleached and weather-worn, their corners curling, their urgency softened by time. Some were half-hidden by tall grass, others pocked with rust, as though the danger itself had grown tired of repeating its message. Jason passed those signs countless times, his gaze more often fixed on the horizon than the faded warnings at his side. Once, a neighbor jogging with him for a short stretch pointed toward the water after hearing a low ripple. But Jason had only glanced and waved it off with a smile, quickening his pace as if to leave the concern behind. To him, the marsh was not a place of lurking threats, but of calm companionship, and any unease was brushed away like sweat from his brow. Yet beneath that calm, the predator waited. The gator did not roar, did not break the surface in spectacle. It remained still, an ancient patience embodied, its power coiled beneath the sheen of water. Nature does not always announce itself, it observes. It lingers. It bides its time until instinct pulls it into motion. And so the signs, both human-made and natural, stood like ignored sentinels, their warnings lost to repetition, their message fading into the quiet arrogance of routine. Jason, bound by his faith in the morning silence, did not see that silence for what it was. The pause before violence, the breath before the strike. The wetlands had given him peace, yes, but in their depths, an ancient hunger endured, waiting for the single moment when his devotion to the shoreline would bring him too close to the edge. Jason's devotion to running was not something he carried in silence. It was woven into the conversations he shared with those closest to him, especially his younger sister, Melissa. They had always been close, bonded not just by blood, but by years of leaning on each other through life's hardships. On a quiet evening a few weeks before the tragedy, they sat together on the porch of his modest home, the air humming with the chorus of cicadas. Jason spoke about his plans for an upcoming marathon, the way he was pushing his endurance, and how the wetlands route gave him the solitude he needed to train without distraction. Melissa listened, her smile warm but her brow furrowed, a flicker of unease threading through her expression. "I don't like that stretch by the water," she admitted softly, her voice carrying a kind of instinctive warning. "You're always running so close to it. I hear stories, Jason. People see things out there." Her concern was genuine, not born of superstition but of love, of the quiet fear siblings carry for each other in the face of risks they cannot control. Jason, however, only laughed gently, brushing her words aside with the calmness of someone who had made peace with his choices. "It's fine, Mel. I've been running that route for years. The gators keep to themselves if you keep to yours." His reassurance was steady, almost practiced, but beneath it was the subtle arrogance of routine, the belief that danger respected boundaries. Melissa sighed, shaking her head, her worry lingering like a shadow even as she smiled back at him. In that moment, the dynamic between them was clear. One voice speaking from intuition, the other from trust in habit. It was a small, almost forgettable exchange at the time, but in hindsight it became a haunting echo, the sound of fate whispering through ordinary words. Their bond made Jason more than a faceless figure. In a headline, he was a brother, a man whose absence would carve a void in the life of someone who had warned him, someone who had loved him enough to voice fear where others stayed silent. And yet his dismissal of her concern was not cold. It was tender, accompanied by a smile that said he believed he was safe, that he could not imagine the wetlands betraying him. That smile, fleeting and gentle, became a symbol of tragic inevitability. The quiet before a storm neither of them could stop. The final reassurance before silence would take his voice forever. The morning of Jason's final run unfolded with the same quiet ceremony as every other. Yet beneath its familiarity, there lingered a heaviness that only hindsight could fully reveal. He stepped out into the dim light of dawn without his headphones, choosing instead to let the sounds of the wetlands guide his rhythm. The air was damp, clinging to his skin with the faint chill of night's retreat, and his breaths came slow and deliberate, timed to the steady cadence of his footsteps. Each strike of his shoes on the earth echoed in the silence like a measured heartbeat, steady, insistent, as though the land itself were keeping pace with him. The camera of memory would trace him there, following his form as he moved along the shoreline path, the world behind him blurring while the water at his side remained in crisp, unyielding focus. He passed through curtains of mist that rose like smoke from the marsh, their tendrils curling around him, catching on his shoulders, dissolving in his wake. Jason inhaled deeply, savoring the scent of wet earth and distant blossoms, exhaling with a satisfaction that came not from conquest, but from communion. He was not running against anything, not against time or weakness. He was running with something, with the land, with the peace it gave him, yet that peace was deceptive. For as he moved, the wetlands seemed to take notice. Ripples spread faintly across the glassy water, disturbances so subtle they could have been dismissed as fish breaking the surface, yet they carried the weight of something more. A heron startled from the reeds, its wings thrashing the air as it lifted, and Jason glanced briefly, admiring the grace of its flight, unaware of the silent eyes fixed on him below. The narration of the land shifted, from a hymn of calm to a whisper of anticipation. There was an uncanny stillness to the water, as if its calm surface was not passive but attentive, an audience watching from the depths. The phrase would linger unspoken yet undeniable. The water seemed to watch him. Each step carried him further along the edge, the rhythm of his body unbroken, while beneath, a predator lay coiled in silence, waiting for the fragile moment when devotion to routine would align with instinct's hunger. It was a morning like any other, and yet it was the last. Not far from where Jason's stride traced the shoreline, a fisherman worked in quiet concentration, setting his lines with the patience born of countless early mornings. His boat rocked gently against the reeds, the water around him lying still as glass, except for the faint plop of bait touching the surface. He had been here many times before, watching the sun climb slowly from the horizon, but on this morning, something unsettled him. The ripples that began to spread across the water were too broad, too deliberate, the kind of disturbance that did not belong to fish or wind. He paused, one hand on his reel, his eyes narrowing as he studied the pattern. There was no sound, only a silence that seemed too heavy, too deliberate, as though the marsh itself had momentarily held its breath. The fisherman shifted uneasily, scanning the expanse, his senses sharpened by the instinct that comes from living close to nature. He noticed the runner on the shore, Jason, his movements steady, oblivious, framed against the rising mist. The contrast struck him, one man bound to his routine, the other suddenly aware of something lurking beyond routine's comfort. The fisherman would later describe it in clipped, uneasy sentences. The water did not move like that without reason, and when it did, it was always a reason one should respect. The silence stretched, the ripples widening as though something immense was adjusting itself below, preparing. He felt the skin on his arms prickle, his gut tighten with a warning he could not voice in time. It was not panic, not yet only a gnawing recognition that something in the ordinary scene had shifted, that the wetlands were no longer a passive backdrop but an active presence, calculating and patient. In that moment, the fisherman became not just an observer, but the sole witness to the fragile balance breaking, his perspective grounding what would soon become unthinkable in the blunt, terrifying reality of human eyes watching a predator rise. Jason slowed his pace as he reached a familiar bend in the shoreline, the place where the path curved closest to the water before pulling away again into the thicket. It was here that he often paused to stretch, a small ritual that broke the rhythm of his run and allowed him to draw in the cool air more deeply. He planted his feet firmly, leaning into the pull of his hamstrings, his eyes scanning the horizon with the calm of a man who believed he knew this land better than it knew him. The wetlands, bathed in the pale shimmer of morning light, seemed to hold their breath around him. Jason exhaled, rolling his shoulders, beads of sweat tracing lines down his temple, falling to the dirt. He bent forward, fingers brushing the ground, and in that silence, a sound reached him, a splash, faint but distinct. He straightened, turning his head toward the water, but saw nothing but the smooth plane of its surface, mist curling like smoke over its edges. He lingered only a moment before wiping his brow, dismissing it as the harmless stir of a fish. Yet beneath that deceptive calm, something vast shifted. A ripple spread outward, slow and deliberate, vanishing almost as soon as it appeared, its origin hidden in the depths. The water seemed to hold a secret just below its sheen, a storm trapped beneath glass, invisible to the man who stretched mere feet away. Jason inhaled again, steadying his breath, lifting his arms above his head, his movements fluid and untroubled. His heartbeat slowed with the pause, unaware that it was already echoing in the awareness of another presence, one that had measured him long before he ever sensed it. Shadows moved beneath the surface, but they moved with the patience of stone, subtle, deliberate, designed not to betray themselves until the moment was right. The marsh grass along the edges swayed in a faint breeze, and the silence deepened, the kind of silence that does not soothe but warns. Jason wiped his sweat with the back of his hand, letting out a small laugh at his own fatigue, utterly unknowing that the still water beside him was not watching idly, but calculating. The peace of his pause was the prelude to violence, the fragile calm before an eruption, the tightening coil of nature's oldest instinct waiting to spring. To Jason, it was a moment of rest. To the predator below, it was the narrowing of distance, the final beats before the storm shattered its glass. The strike came without warning, as if the world itself had split open in an instant. One moment the shoreline was still, a man stretching against the calm of dawn, and the next, the water erupted in a violent surge that shattered the morning silence. The surface, which only heartbeats before had mirrored the pale sky, exploded upward in a shower of spray and force as the massive gator lunged from its hidden place. Jason had no time to react. There was no chance for a startled step back or even a full scream. The predator's jaws clamped around him with crushing precision, dragging him from the safety of earth into the chaos of water. The fisherman who had been watching froze for an instant, his voice caught in his throat before it broke into a desperate, ragged scream that split the still air. "Help! Someone!" The cry seemed to vanish against the vastness of the marsh. Jason's arms flailed, his body twisting violently as he was pulled under, the splash and thrashing reverberating like a terrible drumbeat against the silence that had once seemed sacred. The illusion of routine, of safety, dissolved in those frantic seconds. This was not a distant danger, not a story told in bait shops or whispered warnings. It was raw, brutal reality unfolding in front of human eyes. The gator thrashed with primal force, the water around them boiling with violence, sending waves slamming against the reeds. Jason's struggle was swallowed by the predator's power, his strength meaningless against the sheer weight of instinct perfected through millennia. For the witness, the world tilted, the serene wetlands revealed for what they truly were, not a place of quiet companionship, but a domain where beauty cloaked brutality, where silence had only ever been a mask. In the end, it happened in moments, but those moments stretched, haunting in their clarity, unforgettable in their savagery. The shoreline that had once carried Jason's footsteps was left empty, the earth scarred by the violence that had dragged him away, and the marsh reclaimed its calm as though nothing had occurred. The brutal strike had shattered not only one man's morning, but the fragile illusion that safety could exist along the edge of the wild. When the violence subsided, the silence that followed was even more haunting than the chaos that had preceded it. The thrashing water smoothed into ripples, spreading outward until they were swallowed by the stillness of the marsh, as if the land itself was erasing the evidence of what had just occurred. The fishermen's cries echoed hollowly across the shoreline, desperate calls to a world that seemed unwilling to answer. By the time emergency responders arrived, sirens distant at first, then urgent, their flashing lights cutting across the mist, it was already too late. There was no sign of Jason on the surface, no movement except for the faint swirl of disturbed water. Paramedics and deputies moved with grim efficiency, scanning the reeds, shouting orders, dragging equipment from vehicles, but their urgency felt hollow against the indifference of the scene. The gator itself was visible for only a moment, a massive shadow resting near the reeds, its eyes unblinking, its stillness almost taunting. It lingered briefly, eerily calm, before sliding beneath the water once more, vanishing with the same patience it had displayed before the strike. In its absence, the void it left was not comfort but terror, a reminder of how effortlessly it had claimed a life. The shoreline felt empty in a way that words could not capture. The space Jason had filled with his steady footsteps, now marked only by silence. His absence was not simply the lack of a body, but the hollow echo of routine broken, of a life cut short in a place he had trusted. The responders could only pace the banks, their radios crackling with clipped voices, their faces taut with the knowledge that there would be no rescue, only recovery. And for those who had witnessed the event, for the fisherman who would carry the sight in his memory forever, the void was heavier, still a haunting awareness that the wetlands had swallowed more than a man. They had swallowed peace, familiarity, the illusion that dawn belonged only to the living. What remained was silence, and in that silence, a grief too heavy to name. The wetlands returned to calm as if nothing had happened, the mist rising again in thin curtains, the birds settling back into their rhythms, the water smoothing into its mirror-like surface. To the eye, it was as though dawn had unfolded without interruption. Yet for those who knew what had transpired, the beauty of the scene was stained with absence. Jason Miller was no longer there, his steady footsteps erased, his ritual broken in a single, violent instant. And so the question lingers in the air, heavy and unresolved. Was this the price of our insistence on taming wild spaces for our routines? We carve paths along rivers. We lace shoes and run their edges. We convince ourselves that silence is safety, that beauty is permission. Yet beneath that glassy surface waits an older law, one that does not bend to habit or respect the rituals of human lives. The morning light shimmered across the water, turning it gold, painting the reeds in brilliance, but the brightness only deepened the shadows of what was missing. One runner, whose devotion had become a fixture of the landscape, was gone, leaving behind an emptiness that even the most radiant sunrise could not disguise. The fisherman who witnessed the event would never see calm water the same way again, his eyes forever searching for what might lie beneath. Jason's sister would remember their conversation, his easy smile, his dismissal of her fears, and wonder if fate had already written its ending in that moment. And the community that once admired his discipline would find themselves whispering at dawn, looking toward the wetlands with a new unease, as though the land itself had claimed its due. The story of Jason Miller is not one of recklessness, but of trust. A trust placed in a silence that was never empty, in a calm that was only ever the pause before movement. His absence is the echo of a truth we often choose to ignore. Nature does not forget its instincts, nor does it soften them for us. The wetlands will remain, beautiful and indifferent, their waters reflecting the sky even as they conceal what waits below. And in the end, perhaps that is the most haunting truth, that life continues. The sun rises, the marsh breathes, while one man's final run dissolves into memory. The river keeps its secrets, and silence endures.